Many gyms train hard, but the question is whether or not they actually train well. Fighters will spend years and years drilling technique, sparring, and watching clips, yet their skill barely transfers under pressure. Even as a result of all this training, a lot of the times their skill doesn't transfer under pressure. The reason behind this is because not all training methods are equal and they don't all produce fighting skill at the same rate. All right, so in this video, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be ranking every MMA skill acquisition method based on how well it transfers in terms of real decision making in a fight. This is about what makes you more effective in the cage, and it's not so much about what feels good or what may feel productive. So the first skill acquisition method that we're going to start off with is static drilling. And for static drilling, I'm going to put this all the way up in C tier. What is static drilling? Static drilling is practicing technique in a pre-planned or cooperative way with no resistance as well as no decision making. Everybody who trains has done this. An example of static drilling would be your partner feeds you a jab, you slip, and you counter the same way. Or you could be repeating the same sequence for a number of times. The reason why I put static drilling in C tier is because static drilling is something that helps to encode all of the necessary motor patterns for movement in mixed martial arts or any sport. However, the con of static drilling is that it removes perception, timing, as well as opponent intent. What this results in is that the athlete learns how to move, but he doesn't know when and why to move. Hence, this goes in C tier. Static drilling is something that is useful for familiarization for complete beginners, as well as rehab for people who have technical errors. However, in my opinion, static drilling doesn't transfer much to building functional fight skill under pressure. So the next skill acquisition method that we have is positional sparring, and I'm putting this all the way at S tier. So for those of you who don't know what positional sparring is live sparring that starts from specific positions or specific scenarios. So this could be live sparring starting from the clinch or live sparring starting from half guard or turtle or any position that you would want. And I think that it works especially well if you are starting from bad positions because you learn how to get out of them. Why I'm putting this in S tier is because it's giving you repeated exposure to real fight scenarios along with resistance. And if you are consistently doing positional sparring, you are being exposed to real problems along with live feedback. In positional sparring or situational sparring, timing and decision making, as well as perception, are all being trained together. And this is how practice actually transfers to your sparring or to your fights. So the next thing that we have is live sparring. And when I say live sparring, I'm particularly referring to controlled sparring. And this is being put all the way up in A tier. So live sparring in MMA is full MMA sparring with strikes, takedowns, submissions. However, the intensity and the rules are adjusted in order to reduce the risk of injury. And I would like to put an emphasis on reducing the intensity in most cases in order to protect your brain from neurodegenerative diseases like CTE, because there's a life outside of fighting, so do keep that in mind. Out of all of these training methods, I think that live MMA sparring is the closest thing that you will get to a fight, and it is the most realistic. However, the only disadvantage that I see with live MMA sparring is that you cannot work on specific issues or specific aspects of your game that you might be struggling with. Live MMA sparring includes everything, so you can't really target the things that you might be weak in or the things that you might need to improve. So this is why I'm going to put it in A tier and not S tier. All right. Next up, we have the constraint-led approach, and I'm going to put this in S tier. As a matter of fact, I'm putting this at the top of S tier. I think that this is the future when it comes to training methods, not only in mixed martial arts, but in any sport. So what is the constraints-led approach? The constraints-led approach is when the rules or the conditions of mixed martial arts are changed in order to force specific behaviors or desired behaviors. So in this case, rather than telling athletes what to do, you're basically putting them into situations where they are forced to think and they are forced to solve problems for themselves. And with this approach, they're given repeated exposure to specific problems over time. What this does is it builds adaptability, decision-making, problem-solving, as well as perception. In comparison to positional sparring or live sparring. This is essentially done in very, very specific scenarios. This is used to build perception, decision-making, and timing for very, very specific things. This is why I put it at the top of S tier, because with this, you can work very, very specific things that can make the difference in a fight. And the adjustments are more targeted on top of giving you perception and timing. The next thing that we got up is pad work, and I'm putting this in C tier. Pad work is essentially the same thing as partner drills, but one partner is holding pads while the other is performing a set of sequences and combinations. And these combinations are fixed. In order to perform these combinations, you are given cues. Sometimes, if the pad holder is actually good, then they will react and give you stuff to defend against. A good pad holder will actually give you a certain amount of uncertainty. So, in my opinion, pad holding is good for conditioning. It is good for developing coordination and developing motor patterns that you need for mixed martial arts, the same way that static drilling is. However, in my personal opinion, pad work isn't really the best because it messes with the distance. What I'm saying is that when you're doing pad work, you are hitting something that is a foot away from their head rather than hitting the actual target. So it is not really too good in developing proper distance management. And I think that distance management is very important. At the same time, I will say that it is slightly better when it comes to developing decision making and developing timing in comparison to static drills. So I'll give pad work that over static drills. The next thing that we got is the ecological approach, and I am putting this all the way up in S tier. You know I'm putting it all the way up in S tier, at the top of S tier, as a matter of fact. The ecological approach is actually very, very similar to the constraints-led approach. As a matter of fact, the constraints-led approach is actually something which is included in the umbrella of ecological dynamics. Ecological dynamics is a learning approach which is focused on the interaction between the opponent and the environment. And in this approach, skills emerge from solving problems rather than memorizing techniques. I am putting this in S tier because it has more or less the same advantages of CLA, or the constraints-led approach. All right. So next we have hoarding techniques or collecting techniques. So I'm putting this in D tier. So what is technique hoarding? Technique hoarding is basically collecting all of these moves, and you are not deeply integrating or pressure testing them. Everybody has heard the quote about Bruce Lee: "I don't fear the man who practices 1,000 kicks. I fear the man who practices the same kick 1,000 times," or maybe it was 10,000 times. And while this quote, in my opinion, does lack nuance, there is a core principle that still does hold. And this principle is that you need to practice the same or similar techniques over a long period of time, with variability and decision-making included, of course. So next we have video study, and I'm talking particularly reviewing your own sparring footage and your own fight footage. And this goes in A tier. Okay, so the entire purpose of reviewing your own sparring footage or reviewing your own fight footage is to analyze patterns, see which mistakes you're making, see what you need to fix and what you need to improve on. If you do review your own video footage, then you're less likely to be making the same mistakes over and over again and repeating the same mistakes over and over again. And what this will do is it will, over time, increase tactical awareness, and it will improve your decision making in fights, whether it's in the stand-up, so on the feet, or on the ground. Watching elite fighters is the next method, and I'm not sure whether to put this in A tier or B tier. I'll actually put this in B tier. The purpose of watching elite fighters is to understand styles, tactics, patterns, and their approaches to fighting. And what this does is it can help you build the correct mental models for how to fight. But these mental models are relatively passive unless you don't experiment with them and actually try and apply these in your sparring and in your fights. Next, we got resistance-based drilling, and I'm putting this, where should I put this? Yeah, I'm actually gonna put this in A tier. I'm gonna put this in A tier. It could even go in S tier. So resistance-based drilling is drilling techniques under partial resistance or progressive resistance. and your partner isn't fully cooperating with you. And what this does is it introduces the feedback and variability missing from static drilling. The thing about resistance-based drilling is that it reduces the decision-making because the decision-making is constrained. You know what your partner is going to do. The reason behind this is because the choices are limited and the resistance may be predictable, but it is still a very, very useful tool. Next, we have games-based training. So this is very, very similar to CLA and ecological dynamics. So I'm putting this in S. I think that very well-designed games go into the category of CLA or ecological dynamics, but these categories are not so sharp. Games-based training is training through competitive games with clear winning criteria, scoring criteria, and objectives. And the reason why I put it in S tier is because it does very similar things to what the constraints-led approach and ecological dynamics do. The effectiveness of the game depends entirely on whether or not the game preserves key information that would be used in MMA sparring or MMA fights. All right. Next up, what we got is competition. This is going all the way up in S tier. So competitions are the most representative. If you do compete, then you will be exposed tactically, technically, psychologically, physically, everything. Okay, everything will be exposed when you fight. And the learning value as a result of this is enormous. Now, the thing is that if you fight too much, this can be very, very detrimental to your health. So do make sure that you are programming your fights in a way to protect your health. But I think that if you actually choose to listen to the advice that fights will give you, and if you actually choose to seek out the ways in which fights will expose you and to improve from that, then I think that it's very, very useful. So do compete as much as you possibly can while preserving your health. Flow sparring, I am putting this in A tier. So what flow sparring is it's low intensity sparring and you're avoiding heavy resistance. And the priority here is proper decision making and smooth movement. With flow sparring, you're preserving a lot of the consequences and a lot of the realism just without the intensity. All right. And in this case, you can build a lot of creativity and a lot of the decision making. But the thing missing here is the intensity in fighting. All right. The next thing we got, concept-based learning. So this goes all the way up in A tier. So concept-based learning is the idea that you are learning principles rather than memorizing techniques. All right. And the reason why I put this in A tier is because, yes, you do need to learn the techniques. However, I think that the concepts are way more important because they generalize across situations. And also, due to people's unique physical abilities, I don't really think that everybody is going to be using the same techniques at the same rate. All right. Next thing you have is shadowboxing without constraints or intent. And I'm going to put this in D tier. So shadowboxing without constraints or intent is freeform shadowboxing with no goals, no cues, or intent really. And I think that once again, like static drilling, it is very, very useful for encoding movement patterns. However, you're not given any external information or constraints, which I think is the biggest flaw of this method. And also, it's very, very easy to rehearse ineffective or bad habits. I think that shadowboxing is mainly useful when it is structured and there is some sort of goal or intent rather than just randomly shadowboxing. If you're shadowboxing with intent, then I might put it in C tier, but without intent and it's just random shadowboxing, putting it in D tier. Right. Teaching skills to others, putting this in B tier. So teaching skills to others trains and strengthens the mental models that you have in your own brain. And like anything else, it also exposes gaps in your own understanding. And this indirectly improves life performance, but it is no replacement for actual physical training. So I'm going to put this in B tier. Next, we have ego sparring and gym wars. This is going all the way up in F tier. Now, here's the thing. I think that hard sparring is very, very necessary for stress inoculation when it comes to any combat sport. You do need this before competition, but just having gym wars or ego sparring randomly, it simply doesn't work. So ego sparring or gym wars are basically just high intensity, uncontrolled sparring. And this is driven by ego rather than having specific learning objectives. And this does literally the exact opposite of what you want to do to improve. So in gym wars, the damage that you are taking is maximized, and you're not really going to be learning that much if you're just having ego sparring or doing gym wars. A lot of the times, this can actually stunt your career as well as your skill development. So it's something that I would avoid. Avoid it like the plague. If your gym does a lot of gym wars, then, or even any gym wars for that matter, then you might need to train at a new gym. Collecting moves that you saw on TikTok or other social media, also in D tier. This essentially has the same problem as just collecting random moves. Oftentimes, there is no context, there's no decision making, there's no pressure. Well, it's good to try and experiment with things, but if you're experimenting with random techniques with no structure, um, then I don't really think that this is conducive to your learning. Stress inoculation. So this goes all the way up in A tier and even S tier. All right. This is particularly good with preparing for fights. With stress inoculation, you are training under fatigue or intensity as well as pressure. And this is done mainly through making you tired before you spar or Shark Tank rounds, as well as hard sparring. And this is done to simulate the stress of the fight. Now, in a controlled manner, what this does is it helps to improve decision making under stress, which is what you need in a fight. However, you shouldn't be doing this too early. So if you are just starting to get into any combat sport, I don't think that you should be hard sparring too early. All right. So coach-led technical instruction, this is C tier. Next thing we have is environmental constraints. So this goes roughly in the same category as ecological dynamics and the constraint-led approach. With environmental constraints, you are changing up the environment. So you're changing up the cage size, gloves, the surface, and you're doing this in order to force specific adaptations. So I am actually going to put this between S tier and A tier because doing this is a very useful tool. Something that you want to take away from this video is the people who actually learn faster or progress faster in mixed martial arts don't just train harder, and they don't necessarily do more reps, although that does contribute to your learning speed. The smartest way to train in mixed martial arts, or any sport for that matter, are ways which are representative. You want to train in a manner which is intentional. So if you want to improve faster, then what you need to stop asking is, how hard did I train today? Although that does matter a lot. You need to ask, does your training force better decision making under pressure? This is the main thing that differentiates fighters who are elite from fighters who are not so good. And this is the main difference between looking skilled in the gym and being skilled when it actually does matter. Thanks for watching.